Thank you. I'm Al. I'm an alcoholic. And it's good to be here, you know. I feel good here. I always feel good in an AA meeting. Anyway, I was born in Santa Barbara 40 years ago. And, you know, I was an only child. My parents weren't alcoholics. There was a lot of alcoholism in my family, though. You know, a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins and myself. And as a kid growing up, you know, I used to be exposed to it a lot. I mean, we'd have these crazy parties, and they'd fight, and they'd get crazy, and the cops would come, and it was exciting, you know. It was exciting. And then I got to the age where I used to get involved with it, too, you know. You know, I was always a problem kid. Before I took a drink, I used to get in a lot of trouble. I went to Catholic school, and and the nuns used to, you know, always get on my case, and they had a reason to. And I just used to always get in trouble. I always found myself, you know, being punished. And, you know, they all told me where I was going to go. And, you know, knowing at that age that I was going to go there, you know, everything later on was just freebie stuff, you know. But anyway, you know, they never knew what was wrong with me. They'd say, you know, he's an all right kid most of the time, but then he just gets off on these things. And what it was, you know, I just liked to do what I wanted to do, and I, like, had a mind of my own, and I was going to do it. And I got kicked out of Catholic school, Catholic high school. And then I went to Santa Barbara High, and I got involved with playing football, you know. And back then they had a great tradition of football there. And I loved it. You know, I fell right into it, and it was something that I was good at naturally. I didn't have to work hard at it. I was never capable of working hard at anything. You know, if it didn't come easy, it wasn't going to come. And it came easy. And, you know, it was neat being, you know, big man on campus and all this stuff. And trouble was, you know, after football season, I just wouldn't go to school too much, you know. There wasn't any reason to go to school after football season, and I would just drop in now and then. And what happened was, you know, I got kicked off the team. And it broke my heart, you know. I blamed everybody. I blamed the school. I blamed the teachers. I blamed the coach. And, you know, it was everybody's fault but Al's, you know. They did it to me one more time, you know. And I remember I hid from the coach for a few days, and he finally caught up with me, you know, and he told me that I was worthless, you know. He told me that I had all this ability and I didn't use it right, and that I was just worthless. And I believed it at the time. When he said it, I believed it. And I was told that through the years, and I believed it when people told me that, you know. So, you know, after that, it was like, you know, I'd lost this big thing. And I remember this friend of mine, he got kicked off the team too, and we would, on Friday nights, everybody would go to the games, you know, everybody would be there. And we'd go out cruising and drinking, you know. I started drinking alcoholically at 15. And that was part of why I got kicked off the team, too. And, you know, I remember we would cruise, and the games would be on the radio, and he'd put the game on. I'd say, man, you know, take that shit off, you know, I don't want to hear that shit, you know, I don't care about that stuff, you know, but inside it was breaking my heart, you know, that I couldn't be there. And they had a big game one year, and they wanted us to go down the sidelines with the team, and I told the coach, you know, no, man, I ain't got time for that stuff, you know. I got more important things to do, you know. But the fact of the matter was, you know, it would have broke my heart to be there, and I just always had to play it off like it wasn't no big thing. I did that all my life. But one of the things was that when I was 16 years old, my father died. And I was an only child, and the thing was, you know, I was spoiled rotten by him. He gave me everything I wanted. He never said no to me. And my mother was a disciplinarian as best as she could do. We clashed all our lives, you know. And I remember that after he died, I thought, you know, the only person in the world who loved me died. And I thought that for a lot of years, until I got to this program. You know, because my idea of, if you love me, you give me everything I want, and you never say no to me. You know, that's what I thought love was all about. And that's a pretty twisted way to think of love. So I barely got out of school, and I remember we hung out all summer, and little by little, everybody went off and did their little trips. You know, they went back to school, or they got a job, or, you know, they joined the service. And And our old gang was just kind of fading out, and there was just a few of us left, you know, the hardcores that were still hanging on, drinking at the beach every day. And I just remembered one day I was sitting there and I told them guys, I says, you know, I'm tired of everybody telling me what to do. I'm tired of, you know, the school, my parents, you know, the whole trip. And I says, so they said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to join the Navy, you know. So I did, you know, and they took me. And, you know, I got out of boot camp all right. I didn't get in too much trouble there. And then I got assigned to a ship. They wanted to send me to school, and that was the last, you know, I hated that word. And they said I'd scored good on this test, and they wanted to send me to school back in Key West, Florida. And I said, no, you know, I don't want to go to school. I came here because I don't want to do school anymore. I said, I want to go on a ship, you know, and they put me on a ship. And, you know, I got there, and they're showing me around. You know, this officer's showing me around. And then he comes to these guys that are hanging out there, and he says, you know, you don't hang around with them, you know, they're trouble. You know, and you don't tell me that, you know. You know, if you tell me that, those are the first people I'm going to go looking for, you know. So we found each other. And I used to get in a lot of trouble there, you know. Years later, there was this kid come up to me. He was new, and he come up to me and he says, they told me not to hang around with you, you know. I said, yeah, I understand. Anyway, I used to get in a lot of trouble in the service. You know, it was all alcohol-related stuff, you know. I'd get drunk, I'd get crazy. We used to party a lot in bars, and, you know, these guys like to fight. And we used to fight all the time, and we'd always get hauled in by the shore patrol. You know, we're always getting hauled in by the shore patrol. A lot of time in drunk tanks and stuff, and, you know, you just sleep it off, and they take you back to the ship, and you get some little lightweight punishments most of the time. But it wasn't any big thing, you know. We did it all the time. You know, it's just like I thought everybody did it, you know. Everybody that I hung out with did anyway. But, you know, I got to go all over the world, and I didn't see anything. You know, I've been to Australia, I've been to Hong Kong, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, you know, Vietnam, the whole trip, and I never saw shit but bars, you know. That's all I went to. I wouldn't get past the bars. And, you know, a bar in Carpinteria is just like a bar in Hong Kong, you know. You know, the going-ons are the same, you know. The faces are different, but it's the same stuff, you know. And I never saw anything. And I remember after I came home, people would tell me, oh, God, you went over here and over there. And, you know, I'd have to lie to them and say, oh, yeah, it was beautiful and all this stuff, you know. You know, I haven't seen it yet, you know. I'd like to go back there someday. And I went AWOL in Manila. I kind of liked that place a little bit. And got in trouble, you know, again, got restricted. And that was just the story of my life, you know, all the time. I was always getting in trouble. And I couldn't figure out why a nice guy like me was getting in trouble, you know. So anyway, I did my 4 years there, and they didn't tell me to keep coming back. So I left. And the thing was, you know, I came home to Santa Barbara, and I remember, like, I didn't fit in, you know. I came home, and it was like, it was a slower pace. And I remember going out looking for a job, and I couldn't get one. And there was a lot of us guys, we had just gotten out then. And I remember being real bitter about that. You know, this is my hometown, and I come back here, and I can't even get a job, you know, because they asked me, you know, what experience you got? And I says, you know, I was in the Navy for 4 years. And I'd go to these interviews, you know, and one more time, you know, you didn't get the job. And I remember there were so many times when I wanted to reach over and grab that person and say, this is the reason I don't have any experience, you know, because I went over there. And there was this bitterness, you know, that I had about it all. You know, I was a bitter person for a lot of reasons, and that was one of them. And I remember I just didn't fit in. So, you know, I went to the bars because that was where I fit in, you know. I always fit in the bars. I was comfortable there. I knew how to act there. I knew the talk. I knew the walk. And I knew how to get by, you know. That was like my safe place. It was like a sanctuary from the outside world. I always thought of that, you know. This is a safe place, you know. That world is out there, and it's messed up. And in here, you know, it's my world. And I love bars, you know. I was a bar drinker. So, you know, the years go by. And, you know, the 502s and the things that happen when you drink, you know, when you drink and you drive and you know, the blackouts and, well, you all know, you know, I don't have to, yeah, you all know that one. And, you know, it goes on, and the years fly by, and you're doing the same thing over and over again, you know. And, you know, I thought it was all right. I thought everybody envied me. I thought people wanted to live like me, you know. You know, you go, I really believe that, you know. I thought, hey, man, you know, I go to work, I go out and I party, and that's the only thing I got to do with my life. And I thought, you know, this is what life is all about. And them poor suckers that work 8 to 5 and that are responsible and have families and all this stuff, you know, I bet they wish they could be doing what I was doing, you know. I don't know if I ever thought that when I woke up in jail, but I used to think that when I was out partying. And, you know, it just keeps on, and you know, through the years I had people tell me, you know, that I had a drinking problem and stuff, but you know, I never, you know, what do they know? And once I even had a bartender. I didn't even know this guy. He was like a fill-in bartender at this bar I used to go to, and I was sitting there slamming him down, and he just came over and he says, "Have you ever considered going to Alcoholics Anonymous?" You know? and I like snarled at him and said no, you know, and he left and he didn't bother me anymore. But anyway, you know, I went to a meeting a couple of years before I got sober. I had this friend of mine. We used to drink together and party together, and he came to the program, you know, about 3 years before me. And when he first got sober, I thought, well, you know, he's just doing this because he found this new girlfriend, and he's doing this to make her happy, and he'll be back, you know, we'll save a seat at the bar for him. And, you know, he didn't come back. And he seemed to be getting happier and stuff, you know. He was different. I noticed whenever I'd see him, he'd come over to my house and give me these little subtle hints about, you know, going to Alcoholics Anonymous with him. But, you know, in those days, nothing was subtle. If you mentioned me going to sober up or a meeting or that I might have a problem, you know, it ain't subtle, you know. So, you know, he comes over now and then, and it got to the point to where if I saw him coming and he'd park, you know, and I'd see him get out of his truck, and I saw him out the window, I'd like grab my jacket real quick and act like I was going out of the house, you know, like so I wouldn't have to hear this shit, you know, because I didn't want to hear it, you know. And once I went to a meeting with him, and he took me to a meeting at the old Delano Club in Santa Barbara, and you know, I went and I was buzzed when I went, and I didn't get anything out of it. You know, I wasn't there for the right reasons. I remember sitting there, and I looked around, and I saw a few familiar faces, but most of the people I didn't know, and my mind told me, you know, where did all these people used to drink at? You know, I drank in all the bars in Santa Barbara, and I don't, you know, I don't recognize a lot of them, you know. And that's the kind of stuff that was going through my mind, you know. And I remember feeling sorry for them because they couldn't drink anymore, you know. Yeah, they weren't having fun like I was, you know. They weren't, you know, I don't know why I still related it to fun all the time, you know, but it was like, you know, I wasn't having much fun, but that's what I thought, you know. I thought, I don't know, it was crazy. So anyway, I go to this meeting and I sit through the whole thing, and after the meeting's over, he starts introducing me to people, and I, like, you know, had to get out of there. It kind of made me uncomfortable to be in a room full of people that didn't drink. And so, you know, I said, I'll wait for you outside, and I went outside and I sat on the stairs there, and people were coming out and they asked me if I was new and stuff, and I said, no, I don't belong to this thing, you know. Don't confuse me with anybody. You know? But I tell you, I went on for a couple of years after that. You know, I just wasn't there for the right reason. I was into the denial, you know. And I remember even seeing him get better. I said, well, you know, that's him. And if he needs all these people to sober up, you know, that's his trip. If I ever wanted to do it, which I don't right now, but if I ever do someday, you know, I won't need anybody. I can do it on my own, you know. And then, you know, time goes by and I tried everything. You know, I tried controlled drinking. I tried, you know, doing it on my own. I tried all the things that we do. You know, I tried going to these churches and stuff. You know, I was like anti-church and anti-God from that young age, you know. And all of a sudden, you know, I found myself in these churches looking for something. It's like I wanted to get zapped sober, you know. I thought if I went in this church and there was going to be this beam of sunlight come through, and it was going to zap me sober, and I was going to be all right. You know, I was going to be a person that I've always wanted to be. And I really believed that that was going to happen. And you know, once I even went for 2 months straight, you know, and it didn't happen. And so, you know, I tried other ones. I tried other religions, and I've tried all the things that we do to try to straighten out our lives, you know, but nothing worked. Nothing would work. And you know, towards the end, it was real pitiful. And I was lonely. I was miserable. You know, a friend of mine asked me the other day what was one of my biggest payoffs in sobriety. You know, and I told him, I says, it's that the loneliness isn't there no more. You know, that loneliness that only us alcoholics know. You know, that tears you up inside. And I could be surrounded by people. I was always surrounded by people. You know, I went to bars, and I needed people around me. And the more people I had around me towards the end, the lonelier I was, and I couldn't figure that out. You know, why? You know, and I remember like trying to reach for it. It's like, well, maybe I'm just not with the right group. You know, maybe if I found those people that I drank with, you know, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, whatever, or that place, it was always, you know, I was always looking for it, and I couldn't find it. You know, nothing would do it. And I always says, you know, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. You know, I was always looking for things to happen, and nothing did. You know, I'd go out and I'd go to this bar, and it's like I was miserable. So hey, I'd have to go to the next one. And that's when you get 502s a lot, you know, when you drive around looking for where it's happening. And at the end of the night, you know, I hadn't found it yet. You know, it was that one place that I didn't go to that night. You know, it was always out there somewhere, but I could never find it. And you know, that's a terrible loneliness. I mean, we know it, you know. And when I was talking to this person, I said, you know, it's only like maybe, you know, people who are suffering from certain other diseases, and they're going through it and they're going to die, and they can relate to each other. You know, and I can't relate to what they're going through. I can kind of, but, you know, only they know. And I sit at meetings sometimes, and newcomers or somebody who's got just getting a little bit of time, and they talk about that loneliness has gone away. And the way they say that word sometimes, it just gets to me, because that's a terrible loneliness. I remember, you know, it was, you know, pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization sometimes is too nice a description of what it was in the end. You know, it was terrible. And you know, I thought I was going crazy, and the whole trip, you know, I did this for 21 years, and I just couldn't find it anywhere, you know. And then I thought, well, you know, what you need to do is find a nice lady, and you'll be all right, you know. You know, so, and then I found one, and then I found another one after that one didn't work out. And, you know, she was a divorcee, and I thought, you know, hey, she needs me, and I'll become instantly responsible. You know, she had these kids, and it's like, you know, I'll become an instantly responsible person, and I'll be all right, you know. And the thing was that didn't work out with them was, you know, they didn't like me when I was drinking, and I didn't like them when I wasn't, you know. So anyway, you know, once again, nothing worked, you know. And I remember my last drunk, it was Fiestas in Santa Barbara. It was like, God, you know, if I can't get happy for Fiestas, even a little bit happy, you know, I got to get out there and get some kind of feeling good. And I hadn't felt good in years, you know, but, you know, we just keep looking for it, and we keep want to do it. You know, this time it's going to be different, you know, and it's crazy. And, you know, I need to go back, I think, on the denial part, you know, that I had for so many years. You know, I was an alcoholic from age 15, and you could have never told me that, you know. You could have never told me, because I wouldn't have believed it. I wouldn't have believed that that was the reason I was getting into everything I was, you know. And I see people now trying to stay sober, and they go through these things, and you know, somebody like, it really bothered me, because this person almost died and came to the program, and you know, you 12-step, and you spend a little time with them, then they feel better and they go back out, you know. And I says, that's crazy, you know. Don't they know, you know, don't they know that they're going to die, or what's going to happen to them out there, you know? And then I thought about myself, you know, that at age 22, I ended up in this hospital as a direct result of drinking, and I almost died, you know. It was while I was in the Navy, right before I got out. And I was in this hospital, and they gave me the last rites and this whole trip, man. I mean, I was really sick, and I was in that hospital for 6 weeks, and I thought I was never going to get out of there. And the minute I got out, the first place I went was to get drunk. You know, I went to a bar, and I remember that doctor telling me, you know, he said, I'm finally going to let you out of here. And he says, I know you. He treated me before, you know, stitching up my head and all these alcohol-related trips. So he knew, you know, that I liked to party. And he told me, he says, I know what's on your mind, and I know what you want to do. He says, but, you know, you almost died last time, and if you go out and drink tonight, you're going to be in here tomorrow sicker than you ever were, you know. And my way of thinking was, when I was going through that thing, you know, I kind of like went into a coma for a few days. I was out of it. But I remember before I was out of it, I couldn't move and I couldn't talk or anything. But I heard him say, you know, that if I made it through the night, I was going to make it. And then I remember talking to God, you know, and I didn't talk to God often. It was like, you know, people talk to God all the time, and I'm going to save it for something really good, you know. You know, and, you know, this was it. And I remember saying, you know, that thing that we always say, God, if you get me through this one. And I remember saying, you know, I'll change. And, you know, if you want to take me, I kind of like worked it out with it. I says, you know, if you want to take me, well, that's all right, you know, because, you know, it's up to you anyway. But, like, I'm only 22 and I ain't lived that long. And so, you know, I worked out a little deal with him. And, you know, I made it. And my way of thinking was, after he told me, the doctor told me this, and I went out and I headed for the bar. On my way to the bar, I remember thinking, God didn't spare me 6 weeks ago to take me now, you know. It's like, he means for me to be around a while, you know. You know, we're going to justify and rationalize and use our logic for anything, you know. And that was it, you know, no problem. And, you know, fortunately I didn't end up in the hospital again or anything. But, you know, that's that insanity that we go through out there. And it's a crazy way to live. I see it now, you know. And I see other people doing it. And I see other people going back out, and it hurts, you know. It hurts to see people go back out like that, and because there's a better way, you know. If you're new here, there is a better way to live it, and it's in here. This place will change your life. It's changed mine, and it's changed everybody else's, I'm sure. You know, this program works if you work it. Anyway, I better get on and where am I? Oh, yeah, I'm not to the program yet. Anyway, so finally I went out. What happened was I went out a few days before Fiestas, and I said this was going to be the last time again, you know. Because if I don't drink for Fiestas, it's like I'll prove to myself that I mean business one more time for the whatever, 200th time or whatever. You know, so I went out before Fiestas, and I went out on a little binger, and then Fiestas came, and it's like, okay, you know, going to get down to business here. We're going to stay sober. And I didn't drink for one day, and then that was that first day of Fiestas. Then Thursday was the day of the parade, and everybody takes off from work and goes to the parade and parties, you know. And my girlfriend at the time, she came down. We used to work in the same office and building, and she came down and says, you know, hey, let's go to the parade. You know, it's party time. I says, no, you know. She says, come on, you know. I says, didn't I tell you I quit drinking, you know? I got really mad because she didn't believe me, you know. Nobody believed me anymore. But I remember getting really mad because she didn't believe me one more time, you know. And so I you know, everybody took off and I stayed there working, and there was very few people left working. So after I got off work, I called her up before I got off work, and I says, you know, I'm sorry I jumped in your case, and let's go out and have one. You know, and, you know, I went on another binge, and I drank those 3 days of Fiestas, and I was miserable, you know, the rest of those 4 days. It was 4 days. And I was miserable. I remember, you know, walking the streets, and that was before they had that new law now. You know, everybody used to party in the streets late at night and into the morning. And it was like I was miserable, but I had to put on that I was happy because I couldn't let anybody know how much I hurt, you know. I had to be Al, who's the happiest guy in the world, you know. And I had to throw that out, and I used to pull it off, and that's hard work, you know. You know the hard work that is, you know. I couldn't ever let anybody know that I was hurting inside and how much I was, you know, even that I was at all, let alone how much, you know. And, you know, I think that's one of the reasons I never contemplated suicide, you know. I mean, I did all these crazy things like, you know, wreck cars. I had guns pulled on me, knives pulled on me, and all these things, you know, that are pretty suicidal. But, you know, I didn't think of going out and doing it myself because it was like, you know, God, they're going to read in the paper that I did this, and they're going to know that I wasn't happy, you know. I mean, even after I was gone, I even wanted them to think I was happy, you know. I tell you, today I'm happy. But anyway, you know, I did this last one, and nothing super. I mean, you know, I didn't end up in jail that time, and I didn't, you know, it was just that I was bottomed out. You know, I couldn't live with myself anymore. I couldn't feel good, and I just was drinking not to feel at all. You know how you wake up and you're hurting, and you just got to get there real fast because, you know, you're either feeling bad or you're not feeling at all. The faster you get there, you know, and there was nothing in between. You know, I just went from not feeling at all to feeling bad to not feeling at all, and I couldn't get there fast enough to not feeling at all. You know. And anyway, I remember I woke up that Sunday morning. It was Sunday afternoon, actually, I think. And thinking, you got to ask somebody for help, you know. And for somebody who had a pride and ego like I did, you know, that was a tough thing to do. And I don't know why, you know, I didn't think of the people that I knew in Alcoholics Anonymous. I thought of my boss at work because we'd just gotten this flyer about this new program, you know, this alcohol and stuff program for employees. And I says, you know, tomorrow I'm going to get to work real early and I'm going to talk to my boss and see what I can do about this because, you know, hey, you know, I need help. And I remember I didn't sleep that night, you know. It was like if I fall asleep, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to change my mind. I was so afraid of changing my mind. So I stayed awake all night, you know. And I went there that morning, you know, and I says, you know, I need help. And he says, what about? And I says, you know, my drinking problem. He says, yeah, you got a drug problem too, you know. And I says, yeah, okay, that too. So I didn't think they knew these things, you know. But they believed me when I called in sick that I had the flu and stuff, you know, or when I'd show up later. I used to drink a lot on the job too. Towards the end of my drinking, I used to keep bottles stashed all the time. I used to drink up here because I used to come up here on my job and I'd like have a route to do. And I remember I used to do it real fast so I could get up here and drink. And a couple hours before I went back, and I'd park my business, my company van, you know, around the corner from some bar, you know. And I just had to be drinking all the time in the end, you know. Not just in the end, but in the end I did for sure. And so he asked me what I wanted to do about it, and I said, you know, that's why I'm here. See where you can point me in the right direction. So anyway, I ended up in this treatment center. I had a choice of 4 places, and I picked the one furthest away distance-wise. You know, it's kind of like the further I get away from Santa Barbara, maybe it'll be better for me. And so I ended up in this treatment center down in Dana Point, California, down in Southern California, Orange County. And it was a beautiful place, you know. I picked it out because it was pretty in the brochure they showed me too, you know. And it's up in these woods, and there's a cliff looking down the harbor, and it's a neat place. And what happened was when I got there, you know, it's a pretty ritzy place, and the place I worked for paid for it, and, you know, it was pretty expensive. And I found myself with these people, you know, who, like, you know, they were from Beverly Hills, and they were oil men from Texas and Newport Beach and stuff, you know. And it's like, man, what am I doing here with these people, you know? You know, the only one I related to was a surfer bum guy from Dana Point. We kind of like, you know, we kind of like hung out together, you know. But what I found out was, you know, that these people were just like me, and I think I needed that. You know, I think my higher power gave me that because I always thought I was different, you know. I was different because, you know, whatever I wanted to use. Mexican was always a good one to use, you know. And that's why I always thought, you know, even after in sobriety, you know, why this program wouldn't work for me, the different things. But I'll get on to those, I think. But anyway, I found myself with these people, and they were talking, and they drank for the same reasons I did. And the same things happened to them that happened to me, you know. They wrecked, you know, Ferraris and Porsches and Mercedes, you know, and I wrecked old Chevys, you know. You know, and they got 86 out of the country clubs, and I got 86 out of the bars on Milpa Street down Santa Barbara. You know, but when they were talking about their insides, that's when I knew I was like them. Yeah? And that's what amazed me. It's like, you know, I couldn't be any further different from these people than anybody else. And I think that's why I was thrown in with that bunch. And they were neat. They were beautiful people, you know. One of them used to take me cruising around in his Rolls Royce, you know. And he asked me one time if I wanted to drive it, you know. It was a beautiful car. And I says, no, man, if they see this Mexican driving that car, they're going to think I stole it, you know. So anyway, they were neat people, though. They were beautiful people. And, you know, we all got sober there together, and I started learning about honesty and about myself. And we used to go to AA meetings all the time, you know. And I liked the meetings from the beginning. You know, I liked the people. I wasn't so sure I wanted to buy the whole package, but I liked the people. You know, when they welcomed me as a newcomer, and they told me to keep coming back, and they told me they loved me, and they told me that they cared, I knew there was something there, you know. And then I'd sit at the meetings, and I'd hear them talking about, you know, steps, and I didn't want to buy that yet, you know. And I heard them talking about God, and that was one word that I didn't want to buy into either, you know. But it was kind of like I was so sick that I says, you know, I'll keep coming back. The rest of it, it don't matter for now, you know. I'll just come. Because I knew there was this, I felt in my heart that it was my last stop, that I'd tried everything else, you know. And I'm glad that I did try everything else before I got here. You know, I've stayed here. Ever since I got here, I stayed here. And I think it's only because I did all those other things first, you know, the other fix-me things, and the controlled drinking, and the I'm not an alcoholic, and, you know, all those things, I did them before I got here. So I kind of knew it was the end of the line. I mean, there was nowhere else to go. And I know that sounds kind of gloomy to you newcomers, but it's not, you know. You know, there's nowhere else to go. You're going to find out there's nowhere else you want to go after you've been here a while, you know, where you know what your choices are. And so anyway, you know, I was there for a month or a little longer than that. And some friends of mine from Santa Barbara came to visit me. That friend of mine who used to come and 12-step me. And they told me they'd save me a seat when I got back. And I got back, and I started going to meetings. But what I thought, you know, I thought that I'd taken this crash course in sobriety, and I'd done my time there, and it's like I got it all done, you know. And I don't need to go to these meetings anymore or do any of these other things, you know. Hey, it's all taken care of, you know. And, you know, we like that quick fix. You know, I think that's why a lot of people buy that, you know, 10 days and a couple of weekend follow-up stuff, you know. You know, hey, let's fix it now, you know. We aren't patient. And so, you know, I thought, you know, hey, 30 days and I got it done. And I remember I asked him to be my sponsor, this friend. And I told him, you know, like, after a couple of weeks, I says, look, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think I'm going to hang around here too much longer, you know. He says, well, you need to go to more meetings. I says, hey, you know, I'm going to one every 2 weeks. You know, what do you want? And he says, well, why don't you go more often? I says, because I don't feel bad. I'll come if I feel bad. He says, well, why don't you come all the time? You know, if you come, you might make somebody else feel better, you know. And if you keep coming, maybe you won't feel bad, you know. And I says, oh, I don't know, you know. So anyway, I was going to, like, phase it out of my life. And what happened was I was around enough because I liked the people. I remember that. That was the attraction. And, you know, they were sincere, and I knew there was something here, but, you know, I didn't know if I wanted, like, to find out what the shortcut was, you know. I wanted to find the persons that knew how you take the, you know, where you don't have to do all that stuff, you know, steps. But anyway, I'd never found it. But what I found was, you know, somewhere around 90 days, I felt like drinking. And I'd, you know, been here enough, and was honest enough to tell somebody how I felt. And I made it through, you know, and it was like the first time I'd ever made it through that way, you know, like, God, you know, hey, it works, you know. I wanted to drink and I didn't, you know. I wanted to drink pretty much. It wasn't one of those passing things that came a lot. And it was like, you know, hey, man, maybe I better get into this. You know, maybe this thing really works, and maybe this place will save my life, like they say. Well, because I believed that when I was sick enough when I first got here. But, you know, when I started feeling better, it was like, you know, maybe not. I got it taken care of. You know, like when we're sick, we'll drink that rank-tasting medicine. But when we start feeling better, you don't want to take it anymore, you know. And that's kind of the way I thought, you know. But after that, I kind of like really took to it, you know, and I started doing the things that you have to do to stay sober. And the things you have to do, you know, if you're new here, is that eventually you're going to have to do all those steps, you know. And I didn't do any of them. I didn't rush into any of them, you know. I was backed against the wall when I did all of them. And that's when I do my best work sometimes, you know, when I'm backed against the wall and I'm in pain. Then I will do whatever I got to do to get out of it. And, you know, I've been fortunate enough to stay here. And it hasn't been, you know, I was thinking I just had 3 years just after Fiestas, because I'm a Fiesta baby, you know. Yeah, Fiestas was my last drunk. And so it never bothers me. My ego tells me that they're throwing this big party every year because I'm off the streets, you know. So anyway, you know, if I think of my 3 years, it was like the wonderful ones, the terrible twos, and the thrilling threes, you know. But it was all neat. It was all growth, you know. Everything I had to go through in my second year, I was like on this pink cloud my first year. And in my second year, I went through a lot of pain, and I did a lot of work that I had to do on myself, and a lot of wreckage of the past stuff caught up with me. It doesn't go away, you know. It's going to catch up with you sooner or later, and you're going to have to deal with it. And in my second year, a lot of it caught up with me. And I stayed sober through it, you know. And there was a lot of times when I wanted to drink, and there was once in my first year, I remember that insanity came back, and I like stayed away from meetings, and you know, it grew, you know, you feed that thing, and it just was going. And I decided, you know, that I got off work, and I was walking down the street, and I thought, you know, today's the day, you know. And I'm walking down the street, and I kept running into these people from AA, you know. And I never run into that many one day before or since, you know. And they asked me how I was doing, and, you know, the old, yeah, fine, you know. And they said, are you sure? I said, yeah. And it's like, okay. And then I ran into another couple, and they were going to the movies, and they said, why don't you go to the movies with us? I said, oh, no, I can't. I got other things to do, you know. And they said, are you sure? Come and hang out with us. I said, no, you know. And I ran into a few more going down the street, and then finally I ran into one, and I couldn't lie no more. I remember I said, I feel like drinking, you know, and I think I'm on my way to take a drink. And that was all I had to say, you know, all I had to, and this person took me and hung out with me, and we went to a meeting, and I was all right, you know. And I'm glad that I finally got honest with somebody that trip, because I had another time in my second year that was really, it was really crazy, but it showed me, you know, how a higher power works in my life, sometimes even when I don't want it. And what happened was I got into this insanity again, you know, staying away from the meetings, you know. And I wanted to drink so bad, and it just grew and grew to where that obsession, you know, after a few weeks, it's the only thing on your mind, you know, and it's the only thing you can picture. You know, I kept picturing going to that, my favorite bar, my favorite bartender, getting my favorite drink, and it was there, you know, and I had done everything but do it. I'd done it in my mind, and it was, you know, I was at work, and that old anticipation was back, you know, of 5 o'clock, and I was going to wait till payday. And what happened was I told my sponsor this, you know. After a few weeks, I told my sponsor, I went to say goodbye to him, you know. I said, you know how we get dramatic, you know. And I says, you know, I'm going back out. And he says, you know, you're going to die if you go back out. He says, I know you, and I drank with you, and, you know, you're going to die. And I says, no, not me, you know. And he started talking to me about why I wanted to drink, and he started talking to me about God, you know. He says, well, talk to God. I says, God don't want me to stay sober, you know. He wouldn't have been doing all these things to me lately if he wanted me to stay sober. You know, God works for you guys, you know, but it don't work for me. It works for a certain point, but now it's done, you know. I took it as far as I could. And I remember as I was leaving, I said goodbye, and he told me some other things. I don't remember all of them. But as I was walking out the door, he says, well, I'm going to pray for you, you know. And I says, save your own ass, you know, pray for yourself, you know, because I'm out of here. And I left, and I was waiting that next day. I cashed my check at noon, and I was just sitting there watching the clock. That old anticipation was back, and I knew I was going to go out on a binge. You know, there was no thought of I'm going to go out and have one or drink like, you know, sip on a few. It was the old binger. And what happened was, like, I got this phone call, and the person who called me was the girl that I told you about that I was drinking with at the end of my drinking, and she was pretty young still. She was 22 years old, and she used to get in a lot of trouble. You know, she started going to bars with me, and you know, the things happened to her that happened to me, and her friends would come in during this period of a few years and tell me to help her. They thought like I had these magic words, you know, hey, you don't drink anymore, help her. I says, I'll see if she wants to go to a meeting, and I took her to a meeting once, and she didn't like it, and you know, she kept getting in trouble, getting in jail, and you know, her friends would always come and tell me, says, help her, you know, it's like she's in big trouble all the time. And so what happened was, about 3 o'clock that afternoon, she called me up and she says, I got to see you, you know. I said, okay, maybe I'll see you this weekend. She says, no, I got to see you right now. And so I went up there, and when she saw me, she runs up to me and says, you got to help me stop drinking, you know. And it was like, I thought she wasn't going to get here for a long time, you know. She got here just in time for me. You know, and I remember, but I still remember thinking, when she was there and she told me that, I said, now what am I going to do? Am I going to walk into the Alano Club and tell her that here, this place will save your life, these people will save your life, this program will save your life, but I'll see you later because I'm going out the back door, you know? But once I got her to the meeting, it was all right, you know. I was all right one more time. And I know that those kind of things aren't going to happen every time I go through this. So what I learned to do was to stop it before I get to that craziness, you know. I've learned how to do that. You know, I don't have to get into that insanity. You know, I go through pain and I hurt and all the things, but I know how to stop it now. Cut it short, you know. I still feel pain just as much as I ever did. It just doesn't last as long, you know. You know, I don't get, wait, what's the word I'm looking for? Depressed. Yeah, see, I haven't felt so long I forgot it, man. Yeah. You know, I used to think when I got depressed that I was going to be there for at least 2 weeks minimum, you know. And if there was something coming up in 5 days, I knew I wasn't going to be at this event because I was going to be depressed, you know. It's like, hey, 2 weeks minimum. And, you know, I don't have to do that anymore, you know. I've learned through this program, you know, the way we all learn. You go through these things, you know. You can go through anything and you don't have to drink. I saw it. I saw it in other people, you know, and then I said, well, if that happens to me, maybe I drink, you know. And then it happened to me and I didn't, you know. And there's no reason to drink again, you know, there really isn't. I went through something yesterday, you know, that was painful. And not once did I think of drinking, and it kind of like amazed me because, you know, that was always the first thing I thought of all the time. And then even after I got sober, whenever something came down, that thought was there, you know. And, you know, that's not an option for me today, you know, and I hope it never is again. You know, I've met some beautiful people on this program. I've gone to meetings and conventions, and I love it, you know. I'm not from Santa Barbara. I just moved away about 2-3 weeks ago. And it's the first time I left, you know. I was born and raised in that town, except for those 4 years in the Navy. And it's all right, you know. I feel free. I can do these things today, you know. And I went down to down there where I got sober, that area where I got sober. I always loved it down there. And, you know, the meetings are the same. You know, the feeling's the same. The faces are different. You know, the format's a little different, but it's there. And I felt it as soon as I got there, you know. And like my sponsor told me to make a commitment. You know, I was involved in Santa Barbara. I secretaried meetings. I did what I had to do, you know, the ashtrays before. And I need commitments. And he told me, he says, you know, you go down there and you're a new face, so you're going to make a commitment. And I, went and asked this person at the club. I says, you know, I'd like to make a commitment to make coffee or something. And they said, how long have you been sober? I said, 3 years. She says, I got one for you. You going to stay for the meeting? I said, yeah. So I stayed for the meeting. Then they elected me secretary of this meeting, you know. I just barely got there. But it's great, you know, I need commitments. I love them. You know, because I never could do any. I remember when I kept my first commitment for a year, it was like amazing, you know. It's like I never did anything for a year, you know? And this program, you know, it's just saved my life, you know. I've changed. I've had to. You know, I can't be that same person I was that walked through the doors. You know? I can't be that same person I was 2 years ago or a year ago. You know, I've got to change, and sometimes change doesn't come easy. You know, I don't give things up easy. You know, I hold on to them until the pain of it, and I let it go. You know, I let go sooner now because I don't have a high tolerance for pain anymore. Before I always did. You know, it's like prided myself on it or something in some kind of a sick way. You know, and now I just don't want to, man. I know there's another way. You know, I know I've got a choice, and I'm really glad I'm here tonight. You know, I always feel better after I've done this. And I didn't feel so bad before this time. And I'd like to thank you all for having me. And I do get everything I need in Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you for giving me what I've needed tonight.